Good afternoon. It's always interesting to be a late addition to a schedule like this. In fact, when Morris lined me up late last week, I said, sure, sure. He said, don't worry, you're the fourth speaker, and we only need you to just fill in for a few minutes. And then you may have noticed that Steve vanished, and Jeremy's somewhere between here and Regina on an airplane, soon to land in Saskatoon. So we have his slides, but we don't have him, and that's, you need both, I think. So in my case, I was going to wing it, because I was just going to respond to what other people had said. And then I realized, I better have something substantive to say. So I spend a lot of time in the policy space trying to understand how do we take technologies like we just heard about and actually get them to use so we can do it. So it works technologically. Will it work in terms of the economic, social, political, cultural, consumer system that we have to accommodate? And it's not just where we live in our first instance, it's much more broadly. It's right across the world, because the products that we're going to produce with these technologies are going to be nested in various supply chains that will be distributed worldwide. So there's a lot of what Lauren used to call food miles on these products. So this is a real challenge. And at one level, I could just say, let's talk about what is. There's multiple new biotechnologies. There's CRISPR-Cas9. There's the one we've heard today. We actually did a survey, Stuart Smythe and a number of other of us. I'll get the names wrong, so I'll just stop with Stuart because he's in the room. And we asked, are these real? Are they in use? And are they emerging into the product and market spaces that you're interested in working with? And the short answer is that there's at least a half dozen to a dozen credible candidates that are out there that aren't as niche as the one we've heard about today, but are standard ones that we hear about. Talons, Cisgenesis, CRISPR, ODM, you can go down the list. They're differentially distributed and being used in the countries that are currently now using GM technologies. That's what our survey says. It's not in countries that are still trying to figure out where and how they'll use these technologies. There are feasible pathways to use for the technologies that are coming out of these different tool sets. Generally, as we've heard, and we're all sort of guessing based on directives and statements from regulators without actually seeing, in many cases, the presence of a decision. Because one can say you have a system that works, but we know there are countries around the world that say they have great systems for regulating technologies in the food space, but they've never actually made a decision. So accepting that, a number of countries, and you'll see the list there, that have asserted that they'll follow a case-by-case, what one might view as an enabling approach to the technology, or to the bundle of technologies that are possible. US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, China, Sweden, Australia. You may notice something, except for, well, including Sweden to a lesser extent, most of those are countries that are tolerant of and currently using one or more GM technologies. They're countries that have accommodated and figured out how to deal with one or more applications in one or more areas that suit their socioeconomic conditions. And then there's the rest of the world, which is not a trivial part of the population. There are those that are less interested in the product-based attributes of a technology and are more interested in a triggering mechanism that categorizes products by some designed attribute. Used to be transgenics, now it's moving on. And in those cases, they're contested. The EU is working through deciding whether this fits under the mutagenic exemption or whether it's something different, or maybe it trips over and closes the mutagenic exemption for breeding and review. France is looking for legal judgments. There's some political debates going on. There's scientific panels that are conversing on this, and the scientific consensus is moving towards these propose or introduce no new risks into the food system, then a range of other technologies, some which are the GM, some which are not. Now, whether that will translate into decision-making that will let these products be used in marketplaces is the big $64 question. We do have a number of CRISPR products, and we have a range of other NBT-developed products that have entered the market. I've had the Arctic apple. It's very pleasant, but you know, whether that will be a sustainable product in the world marketplace, given its technological background, is really the question. And I could spend the whole rest of my time talking about the technical aspects, but I'm going to veer now. I'm going to actually sort of key off where one of our earlier speakers today talk about, so what's going to drive whether these things are going to be accepted or not? You know, when I deal with scientists, I get a perpetual frustration projected at me as a social scientist who works with regulators. I've worked in, with, and studied and examined regulatory systems around the world. And there's a frustration that's not just in the food space, it's in the energy space, it's in a whole variety of other technology spaces, that the system and the experts themselves know the answers, and they're not translating into actions that are desired by those who have new products and new technologies to be used. And so there's a sense that the objective evidence isn't influential. So we sort of throw up our hands and say, it's just not working. And there's, you know, let me sort of unpack that, because I think there's some opportunities here for us as scholars to actually take the clarion call from the plenary session earlier about how we might individually and collectively shift the dial a little bit on that. I mean, trust comes from a variety of primary sources, from individuals, either authoritative individuals or just us as actors in the system, individuals, units. It comes from institutions, and it comes from ideas. And that there's a sort of an erosion of trust in those spaces as our systems are being opened deliberately, sometimes being forced open against the will of parts of the system, but to new voices. I mean, it used to be really simple. Scientists sat down with regulators. Politicians usually said, just don't ask us. You know, you ask us what rules we want, you get to make the decisions. And for a long period of time, that worked very well. But now the systems are open. And I don't think in my lifetime, my academic lifetime, or even in the academic lifetime of most of the people in the room here, that you're going to see a system return to a uniquely expert-governed, expert-managed space. So what you're going to be forced to deal with is a whole contested set of areas, and that's what I want to talk about more. I want to talk about sort of the real pathway, the challenge to a pathway to impact and to use of the technologies that we're talking about here today. These scientifically complex changes that we're being dealt with, you know, there are pitfalls, there are dead ends, there's a lot of roadblocks. Our friend Greg Graff studied 580 disclosures in the United States 10 or 12 years ago and discovered only 2 of them were sustained in the market for more than 1 year at the end of a 15-year period. So there's a huge siphoning, filtering, truncating of effort. So there's a lot that gets lost in the system. And the regulatory and decision systems that used to be technocratic, they used to be about what does the science and the evidence tell us, are increasingly supplemented with new processes and new participants. So I want to talk about those and how they drive us. And I want to talk to them from the 3 faces that every one of you exhibits at some point in your life. Every day you're a consumer. Whether you pay cash or you just simply go down the food line and choose what you will consume or not consume. And as a consumer, you're driven by some definition of what's good for you. You do some kind of a cost benefit. I'm trying to lose weight, or I'm famished, or I'm you know, it's it's a diet I don't like. And generally, these are voluntary transactions. Nobody forces you to pick things. Sometimes you don't have the choices you'd like, but you ultimately get to choose not to choose. The second function you have as an individual is everybody somewhere is probably a citizen. At least in the advanced industrial economies that we all live in, or most of us live in, you have some rights as citizens. And as citizens, we have some expectations that the institutions that we've created collectively are about managing public goods and market failures. And we're in a compulsory arrangement. We can't opt out, really. We can move and migrate, but we just join another system. But yet we have certain democratic expectations there. The third group, which is the one that we spend a lot of our time in this policy space talking about, is our role as the social animal. We're driven by passions, interests, values, beliefs. We belong to groups. Even if you don't think you belong to groups, everybody here probably belongs to a dozen groups that influence how you'll think about a problem. You're in a profession, you're in a family, You might have certain religious backgrounds. You believe it, you belong in a community. You have certain schooling backgrounds. You have certain clubs of friends. They might be your bowling club, your fencing club, your book club, but they all help to define what you think is important and what you'll tolerate or accept out of the policy space. So each face has, I'm going to go behind the evidence and look at sort of the drivers of those three faces. Each face has some cognitive challenges. All of them are populated by human beings. And every human being, as rational and as Spockian as we might want to appear, we're not perfect. We make choices to just get on with our lives, and in making those quick choices, we exhibit a whole bunch of challenges. We sometimes get pushed or pulled into making fast, quick, intuitive decisions. Intuition isn't always the best choice, the best reason to make choices. Sometimes thoughtful, rule-based, what we call rational, structured decision-making is a better way of achieving outcomes. But particularly in the public space, when there's a crisis, you get pushed into fast, intuitive thinking unless you've got structured systems. That's why pilots have checklists. That's why doctors now increasingly have protocols on what they will do when all of a sudden things go wrong. But most of us don't have those checklists, so we're pushed and pulled into these spaces. Secondly, we've been demonstrated, it's been demonstrated in a lot of studies, that Kahneman and others, that we can be pushed to either reach out for risk or run away from risk. And we can be primed, even if we know the answer, even if we know the games that people play, we will be forced into tolerating more risk or pulling away from risk. And risk is what we're really talking about, and particularly in areas where we can't quantify the risk, it becomes even more problematic. And thirdly, we do a lot of shortcuts, quick fixes, heuristical thinking, and I'll talk a bit about some of those as they filter into these three faces that each of us lives with. As consumers, we're just interested in what's good for us. That's what drives us. We work, we play, we eat, we save, we invest. Those are all choices that we make. They're made with incomplete information, but they're usually moderated by what's in our interest. And so we can be completely inconsistent as a consumer and say, I'm going to buy that, and ignore what we've said as a citizen or as a social being. That's why we can sell products that are nominally unsafe, yet we want to regulate them. We regulate booze, we regulate tobacco, but yet most of us today might have a drink. Many of us will be sneaking outside to have a smoke. So, we're not fully consistent as human beings. Our choice is dependent on our own preferences. We often have this incomplete information. And there's a prevailing view in the science community, which is problematic actually for even engaging the conversation, that if we just could inform people better on the science, that everything would be great. They'd understand what we understand, and they would actually accept our judgment. It's called the deficit model, or the information deficit model. And so a lot of us, through the last 30, 40 years, we've, not just in this sector, but all technologically enhanced sectors, have spent a lot of time and energy trying to do public advocacy, public education. The evidence sucks. I mean, the bottom line is that isn't how you're going to get acceptance and adoption and enthusiasm for your product. A number of meta studies have been done. One I grabbed for another purpose a while back, tested this aphorism that to know science is to love it. So the idea, can we just get people excited about science, the Bill Nye science guy model, and all of a sudden things will be good. And we'll have a bit of conversation probably at the debate in a couple of days on that. So the reality is that there's just a tiny little positive relationship across a whole bunch of studies in a whole bunch of countries in an extended period of time. So a shallow but broad relationship. Higher education is actually the only sustained minor positive relationship, but it only explains about 8% of the variance of our opinions in a community. So it's a really tiny driver of why we disagree about different things. General science knowledge is largely irrelevant. It shows a minor variable, but just minor. There's a bit of local specific knowledge, so if you actually know something about biology, maybe you'll be marginally more tolerant of GMOs, but it's not enough to change the perspectives of society as a whole. We've already actually seen a reference to Sandman earlier, but I think this notion of taking the risk formula we talk about in our regulatory system, which is hazard times exposure, and adding a third variable, which Sandman calls outrage, is that social measure. It's an attempt to quantify the divergence between the objective evidence and what we actually might do as individuals and human beings. And the evidence is pretty strong that there are some muting factors, things that are voluntary, familiar, and predictable will tolerate a lot of risk. Driving cars, crossing streets, smoking cigarettes. People do them, even though they're known killers. But things that are involuntary, exotic, and random, like GMOs, nuclear power plants, and a whole bunch of other variables, we just say, no, I don't want that. I'm not willing to tolerate that level of risk in my consumption pattern. And this outrage is actually influenced by a whole bunch of cognitive practices that we all are susceptible to. This risk framing, what's called prospect theory, and I won't go into it, but anything we think is warm and fuzzy, we're actually positively motivated to. Anything we think is ugly and undesirable, even if it might be good for us, we're not particularly motivated to it. So a lot of the cartoon visuals we've seen are very mechanistic. Mechanical things don't bring that warm, fuzzy feeling to you. So we're starting from a deficit position of having people affected positively toward the technology. There's a lot of representativeness theory. We draw a lot of variables between, hey, that's risky, so this must be risky, even though there's no correlation between the risk factors. And we do a lot of mental accounting. I do some exercise, so I'm going to go and have a dessert. Don't we all do that? Or I'm going to save and put a little bit of money in this pocket, and that's there, but I can take the money out of this pocket, and I'm good. We do that all the time as citizens and as consumers, and these variables actually allow us to justify why we're inconsistent, and so these we sometimes can work with. The second group is, the second variable is sort of us as the citizen and how we deal with the state. It's there to work for us. It's our creation. It's not natural. It's a human creation. We do change it over time and space. We have built some really robust systems that actually build evidence into the core and foundation of what gets done in the public space. The risk analysis framework, the cost-benefit analysis system, and others. And generally, we are motivated by the right mechanisms in the state space. We don't want to cause harm. We don't want to break that implicit Hippocratic oath of doing no harm. But there's an inevitable trade-off in a lot of these spaces. Do no harm sometimes means you do less of what might be good because you're biased the system towards minimizing risk, but when you minimize risk, you increase the possibility of type 2 errors or rejecting otherwise safe things that could improve the quality of life of individuals and society. And all the usual cognitive biases and groupthink, sort of overconfidence and mental accounting all work in this public space. I won't go into a lot of detail here. I mean, when I talk to scientists, I have to often spend a lot of time saying, look, science is core to this. All the models and metrics and methods that are being used are scientific. All the framing, there's Jeremy, so I'll move faster so we get him on the stage. All the framing is scientific. All of the causal logics and the credible policy and program options are defined by scientists first. They may not be accepted and proved and picked by scientists, but they're framed out by scientists. And the causal stories that actually influence decision makers, the apex decision makers in cabinets and regulatory spaces, they like causal stories. And the causal stories can be powerfully constructed by the scientific space. So at the end of the day, science is a powerful base, but it has to occupy and share space with the public sentiment. We've seen this earlier, so I won't belabor it, but scientists, teachers, and religious leaders are at the top, media, business leaders, and the elected officials are at the bottom. And this was done before we had people like Mr. Trump and others sort of pulling some of the scales down lower. And we do have a structural problem as experts. we actually undercut our credibility. I mean, the Dunning-Kruger effect, I think, you can see that all the time. You get an expert in a room and you say, how confident are you? We were asking about the confidence variables. We'll, as scientists, will always say, well, I'm pretty sure, but here's some things that I might not know that could undercut my confidence. Meanwhile, people who know nothing, they're totally confident about their views. And so they're much more compelling in a conversation because they can actually come out and say, hey, I know what the answer is. Whereas we'll say, I think I know what the answer is. So then there's so how are we doing? Oops. I clicked too fast. So how are we doing? I love this Tang's piece from 1995. I wish somebody would bring it up to date. He said, if we're rational, everybody's life should be worth the same amount, right? Your life, one extra year of you living should be just as valuable as you. Seems a reasonable assumption. So rather than assuming it, he tested to see how much will we invest to save one quality adjusted life year. And he said, we'll only spend about $69 to save a life by mandatory seatbelt use, but we'll spend $20 trillion to save one extra life in the benzene area. So we don't do very well. We can see these wide divergences of elements. And one of the reasons is that we are actually social beings. We're not just individual collective, and we're not just following these rules-based systems. We actually belong to a lot of groups, interest groups, values-based groups, epistemic groups, and our membership amplifies our uncertainties, our divergences of views. They push us into that risk-seeking, risk-avoiding spaces, so we don't converge on the means, and they force us to think about some of the difficult challenges. And the ultimate one that I think we're seeing in spades right now is the emergence of what some of my colleagues call politically motivated reasoning, where objective evidence is not, people aren't stupid, they're just aligned. And this came out, the idea of this social tribalism or politically motivated cognition came out from studying football games in the 1950s. Two football teams play, they would ask people to watch the teams, a certain set of plays, and then to judge what happened. And if it was your team that was penalized for something, you'd say, the ref is blind, he's cheating, he's in the pay of the other guys. But if it was the other team, if it was the opposing team that was judged, you say, hey, they're dirty players and they deserve that. And they're looking at the same event, the same piece of tape. They're not wrong, they're just aligned. So take that, move it into the political space, and you've got politically motivated cognition. So when people say, I don't care what your evidence is, I don't care what the information is, I don't care what you think it is, I'm aligned with this guy and he says different, so I'm not going to listen any further. That's the world we're now living in, and it does strategically drive us away from risk perception, from a balanced level of risk perception, and gets us into this black and white world. Essentially, I won't go into great detail, but essentially we can ask you a whole bunch of questions that can sort of code you whether you're an individual or like to think of yourself as part of a community, or whether you see yourself as seeking equality or seeking some hierarchy where there's winners and losers. And in that world, people who live in hierarchies, who are happy with a non-equal set of outcomes, tend to see lower risks in new technologies like GMOs and new biotechs. But they're not consistent. They might be tolerant of risk in one space and actually intolerant of risk in another. So it's not like it's a Rosetta Stone that will tell you exactly how people will respond at any point in time. But multivariate analysis can tease out a whole bunch of variables that essentially just supports the idea that the deficit model has, and that is that education really isn't that big a deal. Left-right does matter, and how we define left-right is nationally grounded. Canadians would define it differently than Europeans, than Asians, than Americans. But we do find that people who see themselves on the hierarchy, in a sort of a class-based world, are more tolerant of some types of risk. and actually perceive less risk. So what can we do with this kind of a world? We're consumers, we're citizens, we're social beings who rail at the moon. How do we deal with this? Well, for other purposes, I've sort of grappled with this, and it's not a very satisfactory set of answers. But I think, this isn't an argument to say we forget about education and evidence-based advocacy. Those are the baselines to this. That's what we are legitimate purveyors of. It is necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition to achieve social acceptance and a pathway to the market, to effective market use. We need to find ways to address some of these cognitive drivers in consumer choice by dealing with how people partition risk and uncertainty. We need to think about improving the structure and method for incorporating new voices in public choice. We have, in the science world, we have in all of the professions that are engaged in the regulatory space, they have self-governing regulatory control mechanisms that limit the divergences of opinions. So the people who are crazy get pushed to the fringes of their fields. The social advocacy space does not have that self-governing model. And yet we open up the system as if we were all the spaces were identical. So I think there's a lot we could do there in terms of how we deal with this, both at the industry level, at the government level, at the NGO level, and as scholars as part of that. And ultimately, I think we need to think more carefully about how we engage with this tribal space, that it's not a refutation of science as valuable, because the same people who may exhibit a tribal attachment to something that is anti-science in the eyes of the science community may be adhering in another community to something that's extremely well connected to the scientific argumentation. So it's not like we're getting a consistent one. But I think there are ways to change the narratives, change the frames that actually will lead to better public choice. Thank you.